Okay, hello everyone. My name is Scott Moore. I'm a co-founder of Gitcoin and a GP at Public Works, and I'm here to talk about a subject which is very close to my heart. It's also something that I've talked about a lot in the past, but how do we fund the sort of public works that we're building, the public goods that we're building in a more internet age? And I think this is a really important subject just generally because we've done a lot of cool things as a civilization. I would like for us to continue doing lots of cool things as a civilization. And I think this is a really important part of that conversation, especially as we head into sort of a new age. And so some of the things we've built, which I think are particularly cool, are like aqueducts, woodblock printing, which actually preceded the printing press by about 700 years, telegraphs, subway lines, fiber optic cables, TCP/IP, and then now more recently things like the internet itself and Internet Archive, which is sort of an archive on top of that, and things like version control through Git, which allow for more global coordination around that sort of software. And it's particularly relevant now to think about this sort of civilizational arc because I do think we are entering a new sort of networked age. And this networked age is particularly challenging because we're very used to models of kingdoms where there's, one, sort of monarch ruling over things, where we have, sort of one central point of discussion and coordination. And then we sort of evolved into states where we had many different parties across many different jurisdictions with their own models and rules. But now we sort of have networks which I don't think are necessarily meant to totally replace these existing systems, but hopefully can augment these existing systems in order to increase the pace and the sort of degree to which we can come to shared global agreements. And this is particularly important in a world where we face a lot of existential threats, whether those are nuclear war, climate change, or artificial intelligence. And these are actually problems that are so global that we actually don't have a way to coordinate on them on a state level. The closest we've come is something like the UN. And although the UN has done some things, it's clearly not really functioning in a way that actually allows us to reach normatively legitimate agreements or understandings around how to solve these problems. So this is actually, in my opinion, partly just a result of Dunbar's number, which is the idea that after 150 people, it gets much harder to actually coordinate. Mostly because you have this problem of people really only getting to know or be kind of in solidarity with about 150 people before you start losing track of who's who and, really not being able to form that level of deep connection. So this is actually, especially as the world grows, a really important problem for us to solve. And it's actually particularly relevant in the case of open source software, which has been reframed in some ways by the UN as digital public goods. And I think when we think of code as a public good, we should think not just abstractly of the positive externalities it creates and the sort of network effects it creates, but we should also just think practically about the fact that there's $500 billion the value that's being generated. There's about 20 million developers globally that are all working on this. And on top of that, development, you have software companies around the world that are pretty much using this all the time. And despite that, maintainers are getting burned out. There's about 40% of open source maintainers that have highlighted this feeling so far. And about 50% of open source maintainers actually aren't really paid at all. So, and of those who are paid actually less than 30% earn over $1,000, and actually none of them own the work that they're doing in a real sense. So I actually think Web3 can fix this. I know lots of people sort of say Web3 can fix everything. But I do think in some sense it is all coordination. And what I mean by that is that if we sort of realign our incentives and create networks like Ethereum that allow us to coordinate value globally in the same way that we coordinated value, coordinated information, in the sort of early internet age, then we can create more resilient infrastructure. We can have these sort of shared, credible commitments with each other that allow us to basically own assets and own value globally. to distribute that value globally back to people who have given value to the system. And in turn, we can empower everyone to feel like they are part of some global system versus just having people sort of hop in to, check their Twitter, whatever else they might do. That to me is just something that we fundamentally need to shift in our thinking, and Web3, I think, can help with that. So when we think about public goods historically, we actually still think of them in the context of states. And we think of things like clean air or infrastructure as public goods, but we also think of things like subway systems, like I mentioned in the first couple of slides, as public goods. But clearly a public good, can't be in some of these examples fully non-excludable and non-rivalrous, as a lot of the economic definitions suggest. A subway system charges a fee. It also obviously has capacity limits, but we care not about the actual full non-excludability and non-rivalry of the good. We care also about the fact that it actually produces positive externalities for the communities that it serves. So in the case of Hong Kong, for example, the subway system actually is potentially even profitable because the fees plus accrual of value on top of the property that's built on the stations leads to actual revenue for the city, for the system. And in turn, you have more and more public goods that can be created. And it creates a positive flywheel. Now, do we think that because there is this private aspect to the fact that, a room in a condo is clearly non-excludable or clearly excludable and rivalrous, but it is very much a private good. But do we think that that means that the system itself or the fact that it has fees makes it useless and that we should stop funding it? I think that would be absurd to suggest, because clearly it's providing the ability for people to connect with their communities, to connect with local businesses, and fundamentally to engage with society. That's what we're all sort of doing here. It's finding ways to engage with each other towards sort of mutual shared interest. And so I think the better way to frame this is actually this positive externality definition, which is one that, again, works actually really well when you think about network effects in a networked age, but is harder to imagine when you're only thinking locally in the case of individual local jurisdictions. So this is actually something that Vitalik, of course, has already identified and explained really well in a post that he wrote around the revenue evil curve. But what we can do is, in my view, to fund some of these open source developers, to fund some of the people who are building these new age public works, is we can basically take the things that are most congestible, we can tax the congestible, and in turn, we can subsidize these increasing returns. And what I mean by that, and what sort of Vitalik identifies here, I think correctly, is that certain types of goods can be monetized in certain types of ways without losing the overall network effect. The fact that a subway has a fee, as long as that fee is reasonable for the population, does not actually significantly reduce its ability to be really beneficial to that community. And so we should practically not care as much about that individual fee as we should about the positive externalities it creates. Whereas by contrast, if you have something like let's say a plane ticket, which is essentially only priced at a level where almost no one can afford it and goes empty, that would be extremely ineffective as a mechanism for it would essentially be like a very unfortunate way to try to tax that and to fund other public goods, because now this actual entire plane, this entire asset is not being put to use. And this is effectively just like, how do we price things effectively is fundamentally the question. But I think there's also a question of types of models. So for example, copyright of certain types can create a chilling effect where a song is no longer actually really accessible or remixable or able to be accessed by the community in a practical sense, because there's such a threat of litigation associated with it. Similarly, there might be an issue like that with patents. And so my point in this, you could go through a lot of different examples of this, is if we can figure out the right model, uh, I guess first, if we can figure out where these models actually, where a model exists, where it is allowing the network effects to stay uh, consistent, and then secondly, how we can adjust the pricing in that model to effectively or optimally subsidize the increasing returns of other types of public goods, then we can create a system where essentially public infrastructure is funding public infrastructure. And I think that is a fundamental shift from our current approach, where we're thinking about, how can we go to this other entity, this, this philanthropist, or this local government, how can they fix these problems? We can actually build these types of public goods ourselves in this internet age, and we can actually use this open source software to fund itself. And so this is what I think fundamentally is enabled by Ethereum, is we have this sort of agency and ownership over the tools we use. We can leverage these coordination tools together to build sort of new ideas and technologies. We can mint new currencies that fund them and sustain them, whether these are, local currencies or more like kind of centrally backed currencies. And we can design more novel incentive mechanisms to be more regenerative and positive sum versus degen, where we're just extracting value all the time from the systems that we're using and not giving back. This is a great graph actually that identifies the current state of open source software funding on the right, which, or not graph, but I guess sort of just kind of comic, where essentially you've got this one tiny pillar on the bottom, this project that, some random person in Nebraska is maintaining thanklessly, which is, and this is actually true in the case of, for example, OpenSSL, where Heartbleed happened in 2014, 2015, and wiped out billions of dollars of economic value from the global economy because this random person, just no one knew that he was the only person maintaining this and was doing it part-time while he's working a full-time job. But the sort of like comic here is meant to identify the fact that this is a major problem that exists, where you have these very, very fragile parts of the system that we're just not actually aware of. And so we need to actually use these sort of internet funding mechanisms, open source capital, to actually go and search for these problem spaces and then fill in those gaps ourselves with new funding where it's missing. And I do think, by the way, that like a lot of this funding, it is missing now, but does not need to be missing. There are organizations globally that could be funding more of this beyond just us funding it ourselves. But I do think that fundamentally, this is a problem space that anyone from even the local government to state government levels needs to be thinking about, and that then we individually also need to be thinking about. So Ethereum is a great example of where this already occurs quite naturally. Ethereum actually produces massive positive externalities, in my opinion, in the sense that it allows for this global value exchange, these shared commitments, the coordination, as I mentioned, of value in the same way as we were able to coordinate information in the earlier eras of the web. And these positive externalities allow for this self-interested provisioning of public infrastructure. And in turn, we can do this sort of flow back using the sort of tax the congestible, subsidize the increasing returns model to give essentially core developers more funding. And things like DAOs become very useful for this, because DAOs can actually work together towards a common goal on a global basis. And in turn, they can actually generate value in almost a sense that a business would for themselves, but then have, through either Ethereum itself or through their own agreements within the DAO, ways to flow value back down the stack. So just as an aside, I want to make sure folks understand the terminology I'm using. I think most people here are probably familiar with DAOs, but what I mean by a DAO in this case, or by a sort of organization working on Ethereum, is a sort of decentralized autonomous organization. And essentially decentralized here just means control of decision-making and power across the individual group. So distributed sort of network control versus individual or entity control. Autonomous in the sense that it is potentially self-governed. and organizations, just what we're used to as the term for functional and collective structures that allow agents to work towards common goals. But I think these are really useful structures because we didn't really have networked versions of these systems before. We had things like the joint stock companies. We had things like, again, states and kingdoms. But again, there's this challenge at a global level of coordinating across many, many different parties. And clearly, there's gaps that are needing to be filled. So how can we leverage these as part of that solution? I think that's a really interesting problem that we have to start contending with, and that Ethereum, fortunately, is already sort of contending with. So I want to just identify, one of the things that we can do to create more of these DAOs and that we can do to allow them to flourish within existing local jurisdictions in order to essentially scale up to a global level over time. And so this is actually based on Ostrom's principles. So Eleanor Ostrom talks about the idea of sustaining commons. Commons might be fisheries or forests. They're things that are fundamentally rivalrous. If I take a tree from the forest, it is gone for quite a long time, and that is fundamentally the biggest difference between it and a traditional or conventional public good. But what we can sort of do with this model that she identified, which is essentially the tragedy of the commons was a problem, which was identified for these types of commons, where you would have this problem of overfishing or over chopping, like these trees, and essentially that would just deteriorate the commons for no one else to be able to use. But what she realized was, and she actually won the Nobel Prize for this in 2009, is that you can create rules and systems that allow people to set boundaries between communities and common resources to create local rules, basically, that then graduate into more legitimate global rules, and that can then be enforced by these sort of social sanctions in a way that allows you to actually slowly build up essentially maintenance systems for these types of commons over time. And this is particularly relevant for things like open source software, because although they are, in a sense, these global public goods that create positive externalities, all types of public goods are really just sort of asymptotic approximations of commons. And by that, I just mean that, everything is, as I mentioned, somewhat excludable, somewhat rivalrous. And so in that same way, we can actually apply Ostrom's rules to some of these things that we're conventionally thinking of as traditional public goods in the economic sense. So this is really useful because we sort of have this network like Ethereum, which produces these externalities and creates this global value flow. We have organizations on top of this system, which can actually independently create value and create economic models for themselves. And we have the ability for different types of these organizations to create different revenue evil curves to be able to support each other in a networked fashion alongside or aligned with Eleanor Ostrom's rules. So this is actually really important because I do think this means fundamentally that as we create more of these types of DAOs, more of these types of systems, we can create essentially networked states of mind that fund internet age public goods. And this is, this is just sort of like a diagram showing like us taking this sort of space of possible funding and mapping it to this like set of projects. And some of these projects, as you can tell, have models like, for example, Optimism has sequencer fees, ENS has domain registration fees. Gitcoin and Gnosis Guild, by extension, do not have many sustainability models, but those are in progress. And then something like IPFS has very little possibility of creating its own sustainability model necessarily on its own. But ultimately, these systems can work together and flow value between each other in a way that allows them all to reach some level of sustainability, and then sort of maximize the like possible funding within this heuristic map. And if we do this at a local and then global scale, we can kind of form these teams, DAOs, movements, industries, and eventual entire national or global economies that sustain an entirely new type of good. So hopefully we can do that together. I think everyone in this audience hopefully agrees that this is a good idea. I think what I would encourage people to do here is think about the models that you can approach around this problem. And for us, quadratic funding, as this formula at the top shows, has been a big part of this. But I think there's probably lots of other models that we haven't explored yet, lots of DAOs we haven't explored yet that can help solve these problems and help create very useful tools that actually flow value back in the way I mentioned. So I hope people start to build in this bear market more of these types of organizations. This is the best time to build them, and it's the time that we need them the most. And so hopefully together we can build a world where many worlds may fit. And I appreciate all of you being here. Thank you for your time, and hopefully I will hear from you in the future. Cheers.